It's a great pleasure for me to introduce a good friend of mine and also an esteemed colleague, Monique O'Connell. We have been friends since Monique was an undergraduate at Brown University, where I was a very new graduate student at the time, and she went on to earn a bachelor's from Brown University in 1996. And after that, went to Northwestern University, where she earned her PhD in 2002. After a several-year postdoc at Stanford University, she took a position at Wake Forest University in 2004, where she is now an associate professor of history. She is a former Fulbright Fellow. She is a former fellow of Villa Itati, the Harvard Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, where we were together again in Italy for a year in Florence. Her work focuses on Renaissance Italy, particularly the political and social history of Venice. Her first book is entitled Men of Empire, Power and Negotiation in Venice's Maritime State. It was published in 2009 by Johns Hopkins University Press and was very well received at that time. She is currently working on a history of the Mediterranean from Muhammad to Napoleon, which will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2013. And we're actually collaborating on that project. And what she's going to present to you today, I think, is part of that book that we're working on. So please join me in welcoming Professor Monique O'Connell to BYU.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center for hosting me. The subject of my talk today is the Byzantine Empire, which dominated the northeastern Mediterranean from the 6th through the 15th century. And I'd first like to briefly explain how I arrived at this topic, since, as Dr. Dursteller told you, I began my scholarly life as a student of the Italian Renaissance, specifically Venice. We're now working on a synthetic history of the medieval and early modern Mediterranean, and the goal of our project is to provide a readable by undergraduates treatment of Mediterranean history in the millennium between 650 and 1650. And it's this enterprise that has pushed me into new fields of endeavor, such as Byzantium's place in Mediterranean history, which is what I'm going to talk about today. The popularity of the Mediterranean in general is no longer news. Each year, over 200 million tourists flock to the Mediterranean region, making it the most popular tourist destination in the world. And projections suggest this number may surpass 300 million within the decade. These visitors are drawn to the region not only by its pristine beaches and dramatic coastlines, but by its incomparable cultural heritage. The ancient and medieval past that many of these tourists come to view is often a richly multicultural one. They go to see Greek temples in Sicily, Roman ruins in North Africa, or Islamic palaces in Iberia, Crusader castles in Syria, and Ottoman fortifications in Greece. And all of these, I think, offer mute testimony to the fact that the Mediterranean has never been a place with fixed boundaries or stable identities. While many other global regions have been meeting points for different cultures, and so it's certainly not the case that the Mediterranean is the only multicultural place that one can point to. One aspect of the specific and unique character of Mediterranean interactions is the fact that the sea has long been the primary meeting ground for the three great monotheistic traditions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Also, courses on the Mediterranean are increasingly being offered at universities across the country, including this one, as part of the new interest in transcultural and transnational histories. For example, other courses that would fit into this would be the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic world, or world history. And the basic problem that Professor Dursteller and my project seeks to address is that while there are an ever-increasing number of publications in the field of Mediterranean history, they're primarily aimed at specialists, leaving nothing that allows students and scholars in other fields to grasp the basic events and problems of Mediterranean history in an accessible fashion. The works that define the field, Fernand Braudel's The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, Peregrine Horton and Nicholas Purcell's A Corrupting Sea, a study of Mediterranean history, and most recently David Abulafia's The Great Sea, a human history of the Mediterranean, are certainly comprehensive works. They weigh in collectively at 12 pounds and almost 3,000 pages. But while they cover almost anything you can imagine, none of them are particularly accessible to the non-specialist. And I'd like you students out there to imagine sort of showing up in the bookstore and buying a 5-pound, 1,000-page book. You might reconsider your registration in that course. So all of this brings me to the problem that I'd like to focus on today. The role Byzantium has or doesn't have in broader narratives of Mediterranean history. Briefly put, it seems that scholarship on Byzantium has not embraced the Mediterranean paradigm with the same enthusiasm that other fields have, nor have scholars of the Mediterranean included Byzantine history in their own thinking about the subject in a systematic way. And today, I'd like to ask why this might be. Geographically and environmentally, Byzantium is clearly Mediterranean. Scholars have proposed a number of different ways for thinking about the limits of the Mediterranean as a region. Braudel famously stated that the limits of the Mediterranean were where you could cultivate olives and grapes. And you can see those limits marked on the slide there. And the olive and the grape flourish in the region's hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. Horton and Purcell propose a Mediterranean of microregions that are linked to each other through exchange, but in geographical terms, their Mediterranean basically reproduces Braudel's. It extends inward for about 10 miles all the way around the sea. J.R. McNeill, in his book, The Mountains of the Mediterranean, brings in the plateaus. So he focuses on the mountain ridges that run down the Italian and Balkan peninsulas and across the Iberian and Anatolian peninsulas there. And David Abulafia, the most recent entry into the field, focuses on the sea itself and the port cities and islands that provide access to that sea. But by any of these definitions, and at any moment in its 1,000-year history, at least part of Byzantium would fit within the category of Mediterranean. The borders of Byzantium, though, did shift dramatically during the medieval and early modern period. So I'd like to sort of give you a brief rundown on where Byzantium was. It began not as Byzantium, but as the Roman Empire, which was divided into two parts in the year 285 by the Emperor Diocletian. After several decades of civil war, the Roman Emperor Constantine, the victor in those civil wars, briefly reunited the Roman world and moved his capital city east, taking the ancient city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus and turning it into Constantinople, refashioning it into a new Rome that was named after himself. The city highlighted the newly Christian character of Constantine's empire, as well as its increasing shift in emphasis towards the east. One of Constantine's successors, the Emperor Theodosius, continued what Constantine had begun, both in terms of Christianization and the definition into Eastern and Western spheres. And after this point, after Theodosius, the two halves of the Roman Empire were never brought together again. So Byzantium then took up the purple part on the map there. And scholars disagree on precisely when the Eastern Roman Empire ended and Byzantium began, but the general consensus falls on the difficult 6th century. Justinian, the emperor of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, depending on your point of view, attempted to reestablish Roman rule over North Africa and Italy. He was trying to re-Romanize the Mediterranean. And he was, as you can see from the map there, successful in the short term. But a devastating plague and political instability at home made these conquests very temporary. Byzantine territory contracted still further with the arrival of Avar armies from the north here, Persian armies from the east, which are marked in purple, and Arab armies from the south. Constantinople was besieged 3 times during this very difficult century, most seriously in 717. But the city and the empire survived, helped in part by the use of Greek fire to destroy the attacking fleet, which you can see down there. By the end of the 8th century, Byzantium continued to exist, but in a very different form. It had lost its richest provinces, those of Egypt and Syria-Palestine. It had lost 3 of its 4 largest cities, and it had lost much of its polyglot multicultural population. The Byzantine core consolidated into a Greek-speaking, religiously Greek Orthodox medieval state in the 9th century. But this wasn't the end of the story. Byzantium then re-expanded into the Balkans to the frontier of the Danube River, which you can see there, and into the northern Euphrates Valley, east into Anatolia, with campaigns of the early 11th century, but then lost a large chunk of that Anatolian territory to Seljuk Turks later in the same century. And it was these Turkish incursions that prompted the Emperor Manuel Komnenos to call for help from the West, help that came in the form of the Crusades, which did not, as Komnenos had hoped, restore all of its lost territory to Byzantium, although it was, as you can see there, able to retake parts of Anatolia and northern Syria. But then came the disaster of the Fourth Crusade, when a Frankish and Venetian army of Latin Christians were diverted from Muslim Alexandria to Constantinople itself. The resulting sack of the city lasted for several days and despoiled the capital, beginning a 60-year period of Latin rule. It did not, however, end Byzantium entirely. The remnants of the Byzantine aristocracy moved to Nicaea and regrouped, and Byzantine forces retook the city of Constantinople in 1263. But the disruption had allowed various Turkish powers to regain their footholds in Anatolia, and Venice took a great deal of the most centrally Mediterranean parts of the Byzantine Empire, which you can see marked here in red, the Peloponnese, Aegean Islands, and Crete. From then on, there was a gradual attrition of territory to the Ottomans, and by 1400, Byzantine territory had shrunk to areas outside of the 2 remaining large cities themselves, Constantinople and Thessalonica, and the Byzantine Empire formally came to an end in 1453 when Ottoman forces took the city, and after that point, there was no sort of it didn't return. So at this point, one could argue that the Byzantine territory was no longer geographically Mediterranean. But the point of this brief geohistorical exercise is to demonstrate that the political geography of Byzantium, for the majority of its existence, was at least in part Mediterranean. So, this geographical centrality makes Byzantium's general absence from the scholarship on the Mediterranean all the odder. To give you a sense of how this plays out, I surveyed 5 of the main journals on Mediterranean history over 2 decades. Out of almost 1,000 articles in these 5 journals over the most recent 20 volumes, there were 21 articles on Byzantium or Byzantine topics. So a remarkably small proportion of the scholarship that's defined as Mediterranean is actually on Byzantium. The lacuna is particularly striking when one considers that these same journals regularly publish articles on both ancient and modern Greece. So it seems that the whole region of Byzantium secedes from the Mediterranean in the medieval period, only to return in the 19th century as a nation-state. And a similar phenomenon can be found in reverse when one looks at a sample of the main journals in the fields of Byzantine studies. To take Dumbarton Oakes' papers, one of the premier journals in the field, as an example, only 5 of the last 100 articles published have Mediterranean in the title or in the abstract. So while there might be an overlap in terms of subjects looked at, there's certainly not an overlap in terms of the vocabulary or analytic frameworks adopted. And I think part of the explanation for this disconnect lies in the historiography of the Byzantine Empire. The editors of the 2008 Oxford Handbook of Byzantine Studies say that, quote, "For the English-speaking world of the 21st century, Byzantium is something of a black hole." They point to the relatively small place Byzantium has in secondary and university curricula. I think the history department at BYU is one of the few that it offers a course in Byzantine history, as well as the difficulty of access to the non-specialist. The shadow also of the negative assessment of Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon also still hangs over the field. Gibbon saw Byzantium as, quote, "a tedious and uniform tale of weakness and misery," end quote. A generation later, the philosopher Hegel stated that, quote, "its general aspect presents a disgusting picture of imbecility. Wretched, even insane passions stifle the growth of all that is noble in thoughts, deeds, and persons." These judgments persisted and grew even stronger over the next century. The Victorian writer William Lecky stated, quote, "Of the Byzantine Empire, the universal verdict of history is that it constitutes, without a single exception, the most thoroughly base and despicable form that civilization has yet assumed. There has been no other enduring civilization so absolutely destitute of all forms and elements of greatness. The history of the empire is a monotonous story of the intrigues of priests, eunuchs, and women, of poisonings, of conspiracies, of uniform ingratitude." And it's sort of worth asking at this point. I mean, Gibbon published 6 volumes on the topic, and Lecky published 2, causing one to wonder why they bothered if they found the subject so uniformly unworthy. And interestingly enough, there was not a strong reaction to these extremely negative judgments in the place that one would most expect, Greek scholarly circles. It was, in fact, not until the earliest 20th century and the establishment of the Greek nation that the study of Byzantine history was taken up in a serious way as part of a national past by the Greeks themselves. And there, the Orthodox Church and contemporary national and political issues of identity and relations with neighboring states and cultures have profoundly influenced the ways that Byzantine history is presented. And I think the contemporary field of Byzantine studies in the English and American university context is also distinguished because it's extraordinarily interdisciplinary. Byzantinists at American universities are spread between art history, religious studies, history, classics, and language and literature departments. Several recent scholars have pointed out that the Byzantine field as a whole, regardless of discipline, is typically very conservative, very slow to adopt methodological innovations of other disciplines. And perhaps as a result, Byzantium has not been typically included in comparative treatments or theories of state development or so on. It is beginning to gain a place in world history, where it's held up as a comparison to the Tang and Song dynasties in Chinese history. But this is a relatively recent development. Also, a few recent works by specialists in the field have begun to frame Byzantine history in a more explicitly comparative way, looking in particular at its relation to Western Europe and to the Islamic world. And here I'm thinking of scholars like Chris Wickham, Michael McCormick, Olivia Remy Constable, and a number of others who are starting to include Byzantium as a full partner in Mediterranean trade networks and in comparative views of the region, but it still remains somewhat difficult to pull Byzantium into a larger regional framework. And to me, the disconnect between the field of Mediterranean studies and Byzantine studies is so striking that I wonder if there is something beyond historiography that might explain it. To ask a slightly different question, is there something inherently un-Mediterranean about the Byzantine Empire? Does it somehow not fit within larger patterns and themes of medieval Mediterranean history? A full answer to this question is obviously beyond the scope of this talk, but to begin to approach the question, we can look at Byzantine history through the lenses of three of the main themes of Mediterranean history. And the three themes I've picked here are long-term continuity versus change, cultural influence along the routes of commerce and connectivity, and cross-cultural conflict contrasted with coexistence and accommodation. So, the first question, that of long-term continuity versus short-term change, was first posed by Braudel, that great historian of the Mediterranean, who began his book with an examination of what he called the longue durée, quote, a history whose passage is almost imperceptible, a history in which all change is slow, a history of constant repetition, ever-recurring cycles. He sees events like wars, decisions, and heroes as, quote, but surface disturbances, crests of foam that the tides of history carry on their strong backs. In sharp contrast, Abulafia's recent book prioritizes change over time and tells what he calls a human history of the Mediterranean. He states, quote, the human hand has been more important in molding the history of the Mediterranean than Braudel was ever prepared to admit. In the Byzantine context, this question about continuity versus change and the causes of this change can profitably be posed, I think, in the debate over the origins of Byzantium and, by extension, the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. Scholars differ on both when the shift occurred. It can be dated as early as the 4th or as late as the 8th centuries, but they also differ on who or what was responsible. Several scholars point to the actions of the Emperor Justinian. Justinian presided over several cultural and religious changes that have caused a lot of people to think that his reign in the 6th century, in the 500s, was the moment when the Eastern Roman Empire transformed into Byzantium. He condensed and codified Roman law into a new civil law code that incorporated Christianity. He had some Latin legal material translated into Greek, which was rapidly becoming the language of the state as well as the language of the people. He built or rebuilt 33 churches and monasteries in and around the city of Constantinople, and involved himself in the theological disputes over Christian doctrine, solidifying the precedent of imperial involvement and patronage in religious affairs. And as we've seen before, his campaigns in North Africa and in Italy aimed to reestablish Roman control over the Mediterranean world as a whole. And these conquests, while they weren't entirely successful, did shape Byzantine foreign policy towards the West for the next several centuries. A different group of scholars de-emphasize Justinian's actions and look to long-term structural and economic shifts to explain this change. They tend to place Byzantine beginnings slightly later, in the 7th century. In this approach, it's not the actions of a single emperor, but larger geopolitical shifts and a growing difference between East and West that marks the beginning of a distinctive Byzantine civilization. A devastating plague in the 540s caused a demographic collapse across the Mediterranean world, in addition to recurring invasions from peoples of the north and east, in both east and west. And furthermore, the archaeological record shows shrinking cities and a dramatic drop in coin finds, indicating economic contraction. But the eastern part of the Mediterranean was not hit as heavily by these changes as was the case in the West, and the East recovered more quickly. So in 600, it had 3 of the Roman Empire's 4 largest cities, many free property-owning farmers, and much more intellectual sophistication in its cities. And according to this perspective, the decisive break between Rome and Byzantium came with the waves of invasions in the 7th century after Justinian's reign. First Avar and Persian, and then Arab. And it was in responding to these circumstances that the Emperor Leo III and his son Constantine V created the basic structures of the Byzantine polity, which continued into the 12th century. A highly centralized state defended by regional armies with fiscal control from the capital. And Wickham in particular points out that it's in the 8th century that Anatolia becomes such an important part of Byzantine geography, as it becomes the base of the landed aristocracy. It also focuses attention onto Constantinople. And I think here is where I'd like to make the comparison with the rest of Mediterranean history during these centuries. Constantinople, with its traditions of continuity with the imperial past and its role within the highly centralized Byzantine state, stands in contrast to trends in the rest of the Mediterranean, where in the 8th and 9th centuries, people around the region were building new societies on Greco-Roman foundations. Islam proved to be a unifying factor for those who lived in the southern and eastern parts of the region. The Umayyad dynasty was centered in Damascus, below Antioch here, while the Romanized Germanic elites of the north and west used Christianity as a unifying force in their own realms, separating themselves culturally and politically from the Byzantine Empire. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the new imperial capitals of Carolingian Aachen, which is not represented on the map, and Abbasid Baghdad, which is also not represented on the map, had shifted these empires' centers away from the Mediterranean, leaving it as a porous frontier zone where people combined a shared Greco-Roman past with their new religious traditions to different effects. So I think as a political organization, particularly in these centuries, Byzantium doesn't actually look very Mediterranean because it continues to demonstrate an unusual degree of centralization and continuity that lasts all the way through the 13th century. So the second question, or the second example I'd like to look at, is that of connectivity, which has been formulated in Mediterranean terms by Horden and Purcell. They argue that the Mediterranean region is distinguished by its unusual ecological diversity, a diversity that creates a fragmented landscape of microregions that are not just the sum of their parts, or sort of what's in the microregion, but are defined by their constantly changing interactions with other microregions. So this dense web of interaction is what they call connectivity. And most have including Horden and Purcell themselves, have interpreted connectivity in an economic framework, agricultural products or commodities going from one place to another. But I find it really interesting to use Horden and Purcell's idea of connectivity in an area they don't consider, that of luxury goods, which were exchanged as objects of trade, as spoils of war, and as gifts throughout the medieval Mediterranean. Cultural historians in particular have looked at the changing meaning of objects in Iberia or in medieval Spain, where the cultural impact of Muslim textiles and ivory carvings transformed as they went from Muslim to Christian hands. And in a lot of cases, the transformation happened as a result of these items being taken as spoils of war. So what I'm showing you here are ivory caskets made for Muslim elites in Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, which were later transformed into Christian reliquaries, housings for the bones of saints. And you can see in this one, which is held in the Burgos Museum in Spain, a particularly dramatic indication of that. You can see a Byzantine-style gold plate with angels on it has been affixed to the traditionally aniconic, or without images of people or animals, Muslim ivory casket. And you can see here there's a decorative Arabic inscription that runs around the top. So I think that this is a very complicated item that speaks to the way material objects, particularly luxury objects, are being transformed as they move from one cultural sphere to another. And I think, although scholars haven't really taken up this comparative example, I think Byzantine examples could provide a really interesting and important counterpoint. So the example that I'll use is from Leslie Brubaker, who's a scholar who narrates the following example. In 1049, the Byzantine emperor sent a chrysobull, and I'm showing you examples of a chrysobull, not the exact chrysobull that was exchanged. They're scrolls with golden imperial seals, and the Byzantine emperor sent it to the German emperor, Henry III. And in 1050, Henry III sent this chrysobull to a local church, along with relics, liturgical containers, and a letter instructing the church administrators to take the golden seal from the Byzantine chrysobull and transform it into a chalice, but to keep the parchment scroll whole and use it as an altar cloth. If Henry's instructions were carried out, which as a side note seems somewhat doubtful because I can't imagine how you could make this into a chalice. Oops, ooh, back there. But this down here would make an extremely small chalice. But anyway, if these instructions were carried out, these symbols of Byzantine authority were converted into something else entirely. An imperial letter becomes a tablecloth, an emperor's seal becomes a vessel for liquids. And so the messages that were intended to be conveyed and that ended up being conveyed by these documents were diametrically opposed. Their form, function, and meaning started by serving the Byzantines and ended by promoting Henry's dynasty. And so the interesting comparative thing, I think, here is that these objects are not crossing religious boundaries, as would be the case in Muslim to Christian Spain, yet they are still being reimagined and repurposed as they move from one context to another. Another example of the ambiguity inherent in this type of connectivity can be seen in the influence of Byzantine architectural forms, particularly of Justinian's great domed church of Hagia Sophia and his now disappeared church of the Holy Apostles, which you can see represented somewhat abstractly in this manuscript illustration. And which was imitated in Venice. Here you see a cutaway of San Marco, in southern France here, and in Cyprus. And Byzantine emperors occasionally sent craftsmen, builders, and decorators to work on these structures that were being built in Byzantine fashion for other regimes, a gesture that could mean radically different things to donor and recipient. From a Byzantine perspective, grants of money, luxury goods, or craftsmen were symbols of imperial philanthropy, a generous gesture from a cultural center to a less civilized periphery. But these gestures looked very different from the recipient's perspective, as can be clearly seen in the case of the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid's request for Byzantine craftsmen to work on his monumental mosques in Damascus and in Medina. And so here you're seeing the outside of al-Walid's mosque in Damascus, which has been heavily reconstructed, but you still get the idea of its intense Byzantine mosaic decoration on the outside. And here you can see some better preserved mosaics on the inside. They're all very Byzantine in style, but as you'll note, the landscapes are not populated. There are no people, no animals, or so on. It's solely buildings and trees and things like that. And Arab accounts treat the arrival of these Byzantine craftsmen who created these mosaics not as signs of a center giving a gift to a peripheral entity, but as signs of compliance and as Greek acceptance of the superiority of Islam, which was certainly not what the Byzantines intended. And I think another example can be found in the Venetian church of San Marco, which you see here in the way it looks today, and in this mosaic on the facade in the way it would have looked in the 12th century, which you can see the parallels with the Church of the Holy Apostles, particularly in the 5 domes on top. And scholars have shown that the Venetians were self-consciously imitating the Church of the Holy Apostles. It's probable that the chief architect and some mosaicists who worked on this building were from Byzantium as well. But the meaning of this stylistic appropriation changed completely after the sack of Constantinople in 1204, which the Venetians were very much involved in. And when returning Venetian crusaders decorated the building of San Marco with stolen marble, stolen statuary, which you see over there on the left, and most dramatically, the 4 bronze horses which had stood in the hippodrome of Constantinople, and which then decorated the facade of the church. So I think in this example, what had begun as respectful imitation became, by the 14th century, a bid to replace Constantinople's primacy with Venice's. The third case, cross-cultural conflict or coexistence and accommodation, is probably the most recent reason why many find the Mediterranean an important and interesting place to study. And I think it's in this category that Byzantine examples can most easily be integrated into the conversation. While Braudel, Horden, Purcell, and Abulafia do not give this issue much attention in their tomes, scholars across the Mediterranean are increasingly interested in the dynamics of multicultural societies and in the historical relationships between a Muslim East and a Christian West, and they're generally trying to find ways that the interplay of conflict and coexistence allowed for individual and collective negotiations of identity. Within this broad topic of identity on the frontier, the Byzantine case in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in Anatolia, but to a certain degree in the Balkans as well, offers a really useful comparison to the contemporary frontier in Iberia. Speaking very generally, the strong institutions and centralized government in Constantinople give Byzantine frontiers a slightly different shape. Because in Anatolia and the Balkans, the Byzantines are defending long-established borders rather than defining new regimes, as is the case in Christian Spain. In other words, it's a defensive rather than an offensive frontier. One of the primary approaches to the frontier in medieval Iberia looks at the interactions of cultures. And probably the most famous example in the Iberian context is the epic hero El Cid, who begins his career as a warrior for hire, working for a Christian king, is banished, works for a Muslim king, and then conquers Muslim Valencia, which he rules over but allows the Muslim population to stay. So the historical El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz, has a shadowy historical presence, but there are other examples from Spanish society that show his actions were not totally literary or totally unique. One can look, for instance, to the appropriately named Reverter, a baron of Barcelona who was captured in the 1130s by Muslims, carried out the rest of his career as a mercenary for Muslim kings, died in Morocco, whereupon his wife returned to Catalonia, and one of his sons became a Muslim and worked for the Almohad Muslim regime, and the other son was a Christian knight in Catalonia and eventually became a Knight Templar. So, the Byzantine parallel to El Cid is the hero Diogenes Acritus, whose adventures are narrated in an epic poem of the same name. He is literally Diogenes, double born, or of a double descent. The story is situated in Cappadocia, down here, on the Byzantine Arab frontier. The hero's father is an Arab emir who captures a Greek Christian girl on a raid into the region. And when the girl's brothers turn up in Syria to rescue her, they find all the other Greek Christian women who'd been captured, murdered, and mutilated in a ditch. But the emir has fallen in love with their sister, and after one of the brothers defeats the emir in single combat, the emir converts to Christianity, marries the girl, and goes over to the Byzantine side of the border. Their son, Diogenes, is renowned for his strength and speed, and he also steals a bride, in this case from another Byzantine castle, and then settles down to a life as an akritis, a border guard on the Byzantine Arab frontier near the river Euphrates. Interestingly, his main task is not to repel Arab incursions, as you'd sort of assume the job of a border guard would be, but to fight against Greek Christian irregular troops who had turned to banditry. And there are also real-life parallels to Diogenes Akritis. There were a number of Turks who entered Byzantine imperial service in the 11th and 12th centuries, and the reverse phenomenon, Byzantines who entered Turkish service and converted. To give just one example, in 1086, the Seljuk Sultan of Persia, Malik Shah, sent an ambassador to negotiate a treaty. The messenger, called Siayus, was himself Diogenes, with a Turkish father and a Georgian mother. And the emperor persuaded the messenger to change sides. He was baptized and appointed duke of an area up on the Balkan frontier, so presumably his loyalties wouldn't be tested again. And looking north, Paul Stevenson, the scholar, finds that the Byzantine strategy on its Balkan frontier relied on negotiation with the barbarian neighbors there, emphasizing trade, tribute, and accommodation. But there was some unease about these policies of accommodation on both frontiers among the Constantinople elite. Michael Salas, one of the chief intellectuals of the 11th century, criticized, "Now Romanity, or Byzantinity, and barbarity are not kept distinct. They are intermingled and live together. For this reason, the barbarians are at war with us, some on the Euphrates, others on the Danube." Salas's attitude goes some way towards explaining what I think is one of the major differences between Byzantium and its neighbors in a frontier context. While the new ruling elites in Iberia, southern Italy, the Levant, and North Africa deliberately promoted court cultures that drew on multiple traditions and sponsored cross-cultural artistic and intellectual endeavors, Byzantine court culture emphasized tradition, orthodoxy, turning to a classical Hellenic and Christian past rather than to a polycentric present for intellectual and artistic inspiration. And here you can see the Pantokrator Monastery, now Zeriak Kami, which was built by the Komnenos dynasty. It looks backwards for inspiration. Recently excavated floor mosaics deliberately echo early Christian themes and the mosaics on the floor of the Great Palace, which was built in the 6th century by Justinian and then his successors. So, while Byzantine rulers themselves do not embrace the hybrid cultural politics of ruling elites in Spain, Sicily, and Egypt, Byzantine images and iconography forms an essential element in the elite vocabulary of power in the medieval Mediterranean. So I'd like to end with these images from the Norman chapel that was built in Sicily. It was constructed by the Normans, a dynasty that had wrested Sicily from Arab conquerors who had in turn taken it from Byzantines. And Byzantines and Normans were, in fact, at war in the 11th century. But Roger II of Sicily used Byzantine as well as Islamic motifs when articulating his own claim to rulership in the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, as you can see here. So, at the outset of the talk, I asked whether or not Byzantium was in some way un-Mediterranean. I think that a Byzantine history of the Mediterranean is still a ways away, but I hope that the few examples I've offered here today suggest the rich comparative possibilities that lie in a more thoroughgoing integration of Byzantine material into the scholarly networks of Mediterranean studies. Thank you. So So I'm happy to take questions. I understand that some of you have classes at 1 and might need to leave, so please feel free to go. Or feel free to ask a question, either way. There's someone up here.
Okay. So we have a question up here?
Right there.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Seth Mulder. I'm an affiliate faculty research in the School of Family Life.
Great.
Excellent presentation and
Thank
very
you.
informative. It's been suggested that the geography, as well as obviously the Christianity associated with Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, really was the savior to Christianity as it floundered in the West through the Dark Ages, and because of Constantinople's instrumentality in repelling the Islamic push. Would you care to comment on that? Is that true? Do you feel it was that instrumental, considering that there was Moorish Spain? Was Constantinople that important in saving Christianity?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's a really interesting thought exercise in non-factual history to say, well, what would have happened if Constantinople had fallen in 717? And I think that Christianity would still have survived in the West, but I think it would have looked very different, in particular in terms of the mesh between Christianity and philosophical investigation. I think that Christianity in the West, as it existed in the 8th century, was not particularly intellectually rich. I think it was very material. It was focused on relics. It was focused on sort of instrumentality and miracle working. And I think that would have survived in the West. But had Constantinople fallen, I think that the more influenced by Greek philosophy parts of the Christian tradition might not have survived or wouldn't have survived in the same form. But of course, it's really hard to say because Constantinople did survive. So there is this bulwark, I guess, not just against Islam, but in some ways against the changes that are taking place in Western Christianity as well. So I think that it preserves a particular part of the Christian tradition and really shapes the way medieval Christianity happens, if that answers your question. There's someone right here.
Hi, my name is Kyla Mercier, and I'm studying Middle Eastern Studies.
Great.
And I was wondering, you showed us those ivory caskets with the Arabic inscriptions on them.
Oops.
For storing Christian relics. And in one of my other classes, we talked about how sometimes Crusaders, when they would come down to the Holy Lands, they would really like the exotic feel of the Arabic writing. And they would be commissioned to make stuff like this. And sometimes the Arabic wouldn't always make sense. Like it'd be pseudo-Arabic. And I was wondering, in cultural melting pots like Spain and Byzantium, did that happen as often? Were those as popular as they were farther north? Like, because if you can read it and understand that it doesn't make sense, did people still like the exotic feel of it?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. It doesn't happen as often in particularly in Muslim and Christian Spain, because I think in part because many more people can read Arabic in those places. And the other thing is they have such a rich storehouse of items that are actually made by Muslim craftspeople, either for Muslim patrons or by Muslim craftspeople who are making them for Christian patrons. So I think that the existence of a large Muslim population in medieval Iberia gives the art and luxury goods that you see there a very different feel. And the most famous examples of the sort of false Arabic or the meaningless Arabic come from places where there isn't this large Muslim population. So it's a really interesting contrast.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question right here.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I'm Glenn Cooper. I teach Islamic and Byzantine history here. I want to thank you. This is a very refreshing presentation and broad
you.
overview. I have more of a comment that maybe you could respond to, but and it concerns the use of the term Byzantine. Probably what I'm about to say you're familiar with, but I think that your approach to the Mediterraneity, shall we say, of the Byzantine Empire might go a little easier if you eliminate the term Byzantine as an obstacle. It's really a phantom. I noticed that you devoted quite a bit of effort in your presentation to try to define when the Byzantine Empire began. Well, it's kind of difficult to do this when you're using a term that the people we call the Byzantines didn't even recognize. They called themselves Romans all the way down to the end. Even until the 20th century, remnants of the Byzantine Empire thought of themselves as remnants of the Roman Empire. And it's easier to do this if you look at the Byzantine Empire from the perspective of the Muslims. No question that they're Romans, right? And so I know quite well that institutionally, culturally, there are some very important shifts that do occur in the 8th and 9th centuries. But as far as political continuity, there's no break until 1204, extending all the way back to Augustus. And so, I don't know, maybe what you could do, if you even agree with me, what you could do is dispense with this issue right at the beginning and just say, okay, Byzantium is the term of convenience that we use. It really is a term of opprobrium, invented by the West, invented by people like Gibbon to dismiss this whole chapter. And once the ground is cleared and we see that the Byzantine, what we call the Byzantine Empire, is really the Eastern Roman Empire continuing its ancient Mediterranean history, things might go a little smoother. Sorry.
No, I think that's a fantastic idea, actually. And it does sort of solve a number of problems. And one of the reasons that I kept it and am sort of leaning towards at least discussing the issue in this book that we're working on is that people expect to see it there. There are people who are, well, where is Byzantine history? So I guess what you suggest, sort of acknowledging and then leaving it aside, would certainly argue both for a position of continuity and would allow sort of us to put aside the complicated issue of Byzantine studies. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Maybe the next talk I'll give will be called the Eastern Roman Mediterranean in the medieval period. Yeah.
I think about it a lot, and I try to indoctrinate my students in this way. Some of them were hearing your talk, by the way.
Oh, so it sounds like they already know.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Well, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come, and have a great rest of the day.